Welcome to the Guildford Dragon News Hustings. I'm Martin Giles, editor of The Dragon. And first of all, thanks to our host, URCH, for freely providing this church this evening, an excellent and well-equipped venue for this hustings event. Via the URCH website, this event is being live streamed and recorded, so please everyone be aware of that. The Guildford Borough Council election is by common consent the most open anyone can remember. And the advent of the independent parties, Residents for Guildford and Villages and the Guildford Greenbelt Group, means that many wards face a choice of, together with the main national parties, Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat, 4 different parties, sometimes each fielding 2 or 3 candidates with others in the mix too, notably the Green Party represented here this evening. So a few votes here and there might make the crucial difference, especially under the first-past-the-post system. On top of that, with the current campaigning, the debate over local planning and the track record of each party has become quite vitriolic. We all want the best for our town and borough and might not agree how to obtain that, but strong feelings must be controlled this evening. As chairman tonight, I'm determined to do my best to ensure that our hustings is conducted properly and standards of conduct are maintained. In particular, I would warn everyone, including panel members, that we are all subject to the law of slander and everyone should refrain from making personal allegations. Instead, we should concentrate on party policies and their track records. I will do my best to get panel members to answer your questions directly, concisely, without deviation or speech-making, and I will interrupt them if that's what I detect. My assistant tells me that they put truth jugs in these water. We'll see how true that is. I will also stop anyone in the audience who tries to interrupt or disrupt the meeting. You don't look too rowdy a lot, but you never know. If anyone here, panel member or audience member, cannot agree to comply, please leave now. Good. Thank you. And so you know, the meeting will end at 9 p.m. Right, thank you very much. And we've got to now rely on my technology to get to the first question. Oh. I beg your pardon? Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Nikki. Now, to introduce the panel, We charge extra for jokes, so don't laugh. Now, to introduce the panel, representing all the parties with seats on the current council, and all of whom are candidates in this election. Representing the Conservative Party, on my right, is Paul Spooner, who's standing in Westborough. Representing the Green Party is Claire Whitehouse, who's standing in Ash Wharf. Representing the Guildford Greenbelt Group is Ramsey Nagati, who's standing in Shalford. Representing the Labour Party is Anne Rouse, who's standing in Stoulton South. Next to Anne is representing the Liberal Democrat Party is George Potter, who's standing in Bertham. And finally, representing the Residents for Guildford and Villages Party is Josh Bigmore, who's standing in Merrow. So thank you to them for all being willing to face your scrutiny tonight. And now I'll go to the first question. It's for James Palmer. From James Palmer, please, if you could.
Good evening. How high is too high for Guildford Town Centre development?
Okay, and I'm going to go first of all with that question to Josh Bigmore.
Oh, sorry, I'm going for the wrong microphone. Thanks for the question. I think there's Martin produced an article today that was published about the various different approaches to height. I think the key point about height and density is it has to constitute harm. So I think having a blanket policy across the whole of Guildford on a particular height, an arbitrary height, is wrong. I think we have to have a zonal approach, and I think we have to work out where, 6, 7 stories is appropriate, where maybe slightly higher is appropriate, or where maybe 2 stories is inappropriate. I think that obviously around the conservation areas, the heritage assets of the town, anything higher than what's there already is clearly unacceptable. We obviously have more degrees of freedom and flexibility in other areas of the town where there's already relatively high buildings, and we won't impact any of the views. So I think we need to have a well-evidenced policy, and really having just a blanket 6-storey is not going to pass muster with a planning inspector when we have to show an evidence sound policy. So I think, we need to do that work, and we also need to consult with residents widely about what they think, because there's clearly a wide range of views around the borough of what's appropriate where, and that's so it will. We need to listen to everyone that interacts with the town centre.
But Joss, under your party, proposals have gone in that have included buildings of up to 13 stories. So why is that?
We don't have control over what private developers put in as an application. The North Street site is an allocated site in the local plan, and it had 400 homes and 41,000 square metres of retail, which constituted a certain size, bulk and massing on that site that was found sound as an allocation in the local plan. Now, at some point around the turn of the administrations in May, there was a scheme that we caught sight of in May, June 2019 that had 750 homes. That was considerably bulkier than what the developer eventually submitted, and that was a result of negotiations with the planning department, and also the multiple public consultations that reduced the height and the bulk to 475 homes. I appreciate that is still too high for some, but I do think it's important to recognise there are a lot of benefits to that scheme: the bus station, the pedestrianisation, the medical centre, the 4 public squares. So there was obviously the height is harmful, but there were benefits to that scheme that have to be weighed against the harms, and it's up to the eye of the beholder as to what is worse, the harms or the benefits of the benefits. Okay, thank you. If you could pass the microphone to George. George, you've been in coalition with R4GV over the last, well, not the entire 4-year period, but for most of the last 4-year period. Why didn't Guildford get a height policy during that period?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd also like to answer James Palmer's question as to how high is too high.
Okay.
And then I'll come on to your question, if that's okay, Martin. Our view as the Liberal Democrats is that when the development management policies are being developed, the consensus by and large in the council was that rather than having a blanket height policy, which could have easily become a target for developers, or if you say it's 8 stories and now every developer wants to build 8 stories, instead of doing that, the consensus was around having a policy of requiring views assessments for tall developments. And given the recent support by R4GV for 8 stories against the objections of Historic England in a conservation area at Debenhams, there's support for 13 stories at North Street, it's become quite clear that policy isn't good enough, and that therefore as Liberal Democrats, we want to have the entire area looked again in the local plan review after the election. And we're quite clear that, we probably need, I would agree with Joss on this, we need a zonal approach of saying that this height for this area, this height for this area, and we need to ask the public. In terms of your question, Martin, the reason as why we didn't have one, I think it's a combination of things. Obviously, Joss would be better placed to answer it, given that he's been in charge of planning policy since 2021. But certainly, what was being talked about back in 21 was the idea of either having a blanket height limit or having a views policy. That was obviously, the views policy was what the officers recommended. It was what R4GV backed in their submission to the consultation of development management policies. It's what we as Liberal Democrats backed. I think it was what Labour and the Conservatives tended to back at the time. Over the last couple of years, it's become quite apparent from North Street and from others that doesn't work. It doesn't give the planning powers that we need to say this is too high, this is out of character. But I'll also just add, it is also about balance, because certainly it's not just, as Joss said, you've got to consider, well, what are the other benefits? In the case of North Street, you had a bus station which the bus operators said wasn't fit for purpose. You had just 4% affordable housing, and you had a height that was being imposed by the Guildford Society. For us, that balance was wrong, but we do need to bear in mind that it may be that in other cases, in a place where you might say that a 5-storey scheme with 40% affordable housing is more acceptable than a 4-story scheme with 4%.
Okay, thank you. So going back to the original question, which you quite rightly referred to, how high, what would be the height limit for the North Street development, in your view?
In my personal view, I think it depends an awful lot on what you get on it. If they fix the bus station, if they increase the percentage of affordable housing, then that's one thing. If all they're doing is keeping those things exactly as they are and just reducing the height.
Right. So
then
if
that's
they
not
did
enough.
those things, what would be your preferred height limit?
Again, I think it's how long is a piece of string. Personally speaking, I would say that, again, 12 stories seems a bit too high, but 10 stories is would be in an ideal world. But again, if I had a choice between 10 stories with 0% affordable housing and 11 stories with 40% affordable housing,
10
I would
stories
rather,
on North Street.
if there was a choice between the two, I'd rather see the 11 stories and get the affordable housing, because that is a greater benefit than 1 story of height.
Okay,
and that's
you.
the view that my party shares, that affordable housing is one of the most highest priorities that we have in this borough.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Paul, if I can pass the microphone to you and refer you back to the original question. How high is too high in Guildford?
Yes. I mean, the key issue here again is zonal, because in some areas 4 stories would be too high, and in other areas 8 stories would be perfectly acceptable. So it would depend where. And I think that one thing we did before the local plan part 2, which has taken several years to come through, was try, particularly after Solent, which was a very disappointing result, that I think pretty much everyone from all parties and all the stakeholders would agree was allowed on appeal, is to try and manage the views as the very minimum short-term thing that we could apply. So we did produce an SPT, or a supplementary planning document, with the key views. My goodness, we had lots of arguments within my own party, let alone across other parties back in 2018, to come up with the most important views. But we thought that would be enough, at least until the local plan part 2 came through, which is always going to take time. And of course it has taken time, but we haven't still moved to put in height protection.
But in fact, that policy didn't prove to be protection against the North Street development, did it? If you go by the council officer recommendation.
Was it used, Martin? I don't know if it was even
Well,
used.
the council officers recommended it. Did they not look at it?
I've asked that question many times, and I've asked colleagues here as well if they know. I've not seen any visibility of the view study being used in North Street. That does not mean it definitely wasn't, but I've got no visibility as to whether it was.
But the council officers should have looked at it, shouldn't they?
That is policy, so yes, they should.
Okay. So I go back to the original question then. For you, how high is too high in the North Street development?
In North Street, I think 8 stories is enough.
And would that be across the whole?
No, because I think much more important for me personally, but also I think for most of my colleagues, is good design. So if you're doing something that's interesting, if you're building design into something, you can push it a little. But if you've got a very bland, I mean, Berkeley Homes have produced some superb buildings up in town. I mean, they can go up to 8 stories in London and they look absolutely gorgeous. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing in Guildford. They're much more boring.
No, and when they did the public consultation that they did do, the traditional styling was preferred.
Yes.
So it's hard to do traditional at high level, isn't it?
It's hard to do traditional at high level and it becomes more expensive. And there's the issue. So that's the trade-off.
Okay, thank you very much. If you could pass it to Ramsey, please. Ramsey, you were one of the few to call for a height limit during the debates on the planning policies, or the part 2 of the local plan. How high is too high for you?
Well, clearly Woking is too high. The height has to be taken into consideration, the site, the topography of the site, and the effect on the surrounding area. Height affects a lot of things. It affects the light and shade. It can affect the views. It can give a feeling of overpoweringness to people in the street that they don't like. It can cause wind tunnels between the buildings. It's not just views, but the views are important. However, Paul referred to the SPD and said the officers should follow that because it's policy, but SPDs are only guidance, they're not policy. The DMPs are the policy, and when it came to the DMPs, I stood up and said, I feel we need a height policy. And one of the reasons we need a height policy is if a developer is bidding, as we found with Debenhams, who outbid Guildford Borough Council to buy the site, they could have in their mind 14, 15, 16, whatever height that they're planning to put there. And as the discussions go on, if you manage to get the height down, you will find that the viability is then brought into play, and they will argue that on viability grounds, they then can't, if they reduce the height, they can't afford to provide any affordable homes, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so a height restriction is important to counter the viability argument. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Anything which impacts on key views is obviously too high. We need a standard. It has to take into account the situation, the height, and how the effect of those buildings are on the surrounding area.
Why do you think you weren't listened to more during the debate in the council?
I often wonder that. I often raise very good points and just get ignored by the bigger groups thinking that they're working to their, I don't know whether they've been whipped or what, but they...
So did you get the impression that the others were concerned about height?
No.
Okay, thank you. Anne, if I can come to you now. How high is too high for you?
It's a really difficult question for me to answer personally. I mean, I think in terms of Guildford, we need to look at zonal heights, that in some areas, as other members of the panel were saying, it's suitable to be higher, but we need to make it appropriate to the surroundings. We need to actually take into account not only the views, we need to take into account the lighting that's available in the properties as well.
Sorry for interrupting, but I mean, it is a subjective view, isn't it? How high is too high?
It is.
But what does your party think about it? What you presumably have debated it. Have you come to a conclusion about what your height guide would be for, or height rules would be for Guildford?
Yes, we've decided that it would be a zonal thing, that
right.
In specific areas you can get away with higher buildings than you can in others.
Okay, and for the North Street site?
I have no idea. I mean, I think, to be honest with you, we need to make sure that it's what the people of Guildford think are happy with the height, not what we think as a panel, not what we think as a party. And I think it's really difficult when you say you're consulting with residents, because I've looked at some of the planning applications that have gone in, and the only way available to consult with most residents is online or coming along to see presentations. But how do you actually consult with those residents who don't have access to online dates, whose opinion is not taken into account? And one of the things I feel very strongly about is that Guildford Council have been excellent in some ways of getting information out. Voter ID is a classic example, but it's not the same on housing policies or planning,
So how
and
would
it
you
needs
do it?
to be.
What difference would Labour do if they were in charge to consultation?
Well, I have to say, we're here as representatives of certain wards. I would go round to my constituents, knock on the doors and ask them. It's actually not too difficult, Martin.
But do you think that that hasn't happened?
I do think that hasn't happened.
Okay.
I might be wrong.
Okay. No, because I want to give Claire a chance to speak as well. Claire, how high is too high for you?
Okay. I'm just going to flag up, this is the first time I've ever responded to a question to hustings. And
Well done.
I've listened to the comments from... No, don't clap yet. Please don't clap yet. I haven't done anything remarkable yet. I've listened to the comments from the other members of the panels, and I think they all do make good comments. From the Green Party's perspective, what we're looking at with any sort of development, particularly housing, is that it works for local people. So I would pick up on what Anne has said about doing a broader consultation, not only involving people who are likely to live in those particular dwellings, but will also be using North Street at a point when it has been developed to get an idea of what they would like to see. I suggest that for across the whole of Guildford, the zonal approach, which has been suggested by most people, apart from Ramsey. No, you like zonal approach? Okay, fair enough. Is probably a good way to go. As a personal opinion, and probably not representing my party members exactly, but as a personal opinion, I feel that 8 stories is too high on North Street. I think it should be more representative of the buildings that are already there. And putting aside cost, I would prefer to see a more traditional build that fits in better with that particular area.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to you, Ramsey, but 1 minute. Before we come back, I want to go to the audience and just ask, has anyone here got strong views on what the height limit should be for Guildford? Yes, madam. 1 minute, please.
I've got a business in Guildford.
Can you speak?
Oh, sorry.
That's it.
I've got a business in Guildford, and I was so excited by that development, and a lot of business in Guildford were. And it would have been lovely to see Guildford really come alive again, because so many businesses have closed down. And when it comes to a height of a building and it comes to the economy of Guildford, for me it's a no-brainer. And it's all about sustainability, this build. It's all about the future. We can stay in the old ways, but I want to move forward. And so many people do. And so many people are really upset that it hasn't moved forward.
Okay.
And I've had a quick one. I've had a word with Zero Carbon Guildford, and they've offered... oh, no. We did? Oh, okay. No problem. But I've been knocking on doors and I've been talking to people. I've been really interested to find out how people feel.
Okay, so you're disappointed that the proposal did not go through.
I'm very disappointed.
Are you associated with any party? Are you...
Well, when I heard that residents for Guildford were behind, I said to them, I'm 100% behind you because it's that important to me. I'm here... I've never been to anything like this before, and.
But are you a candidate for them?
Sorry?
Are you a candidate for them?
No.
Okay.
I'm just.
So
I'm a Guildford girl, and that's it.
Has anyone else got a different view, perhaps? Yes, the lady
but
behind you.
it's great to have all different views.
Where? Oh, okay. Thank you.
Oh, I'm Sue. I am in the Labour Party,
Yes, sorry.
so I do have a view. But I want to ask, if everybody's in such good agreement that we need zonal heights and that we want to do this modestly and in keeping, why the hell have the council been unable to agree it? Can you not get together and agree a reasonable proposal to put to the people?
Oh. A good point. There's a gentleman at the back and one in the middle over here. Whichever the microphone gets to. One on the end, okay.
I think it's about balance. So, for example, if there was one landmark tower that could be taller than 8 stories, but it was truly innovative, really interesting, and actually...
Okay, thank you. And perhaps you could pass the microphone along. There we go.
Without causing that
Okay, so this
row.
okay. 1 minute, Kieran. Yes.
I think the way to approach this is to look at what developments in Guildford, and particularly in the town centre, have worked well, fit in appropriately, and are generally regarded as successes. Now, there aren't too many of them, I have to say, over recent years, but my guideline for that would be Printing House Square, which I think meets all the conditions you would want to meet for a good urban residential, well, predominantly residential development. And that points, I think, to 5, 6 as the sort of maximum. And if you can start from our past experience, then I don't think you will go too wrong.
Thank you. Kieran Doran, who I'm going to introduce as the chair of the Liberal Democrat Party at the back.
Oh, I was going to say that, Martin.
Okay.
Yeah, declare my interest. I'm with the Liberal Democrats. I would support exactly what George said. I think there should be a zonal height policy. I've spent the last 3 years spending most of my working life in Munich, and in the suburbs of Munich, they have that type of policy. It's 6 stories high, end of, no discussion. But they also have what we believe in quite passionately is affordable housing, their equivalent of affordable housing quotas. What's really, really wrong here with the North Street development is not just the height. It's the rather insulting, as one of the Conservative and the Liberal Democrats people who voted against North Street said on the 11th of January, it's rather insulting that when we put in place as a council a 40% requirement of affordable housing for ordinary workers in Guildford, and I don't know when it was, maybe you can help me out here, Martin, but it was 15 or 20 years ago, don't know what the statistic is right now, but around that time, at the early part of this century, no firefighter who worked in Guildford could afford to live in the borough. That's what we have to do in Guildford. We've got to get height right, of course, but we've also got to make Guildford the right type of place for people who work and operate this town.
Thank you. And so if the choice was before you that you could either have 8 stories with 40% social housing, or affordable housing, I should say, or 6 stories without, what would you do?
Well, which one of my 2 sons is my favourite? That's the Hobson's choice. You're absolutely right. We have to go for those sorts of tough questions. Personally...
Yeah, but am I right in thinking the Liberal Democrat view is social housing is a priority?
Affordable housing is a priority, but
is the priority.
Not at absolutely any cost, Martin.
No.
Not at absolutely any cost.
But in that scenario?
In that scenario, but I would also add on to that, why is North Street the only wreck of a site that's been here for the last 30, 40 years that's being addressed right now? Look at Bright Hill. I've been in Guildford 40 years. Bright Hill's been empty 50, at least. Look at the site down the Portsmouth Road here. Is it because these are only commercial? Okay, I'm going to come back to the panel now. Ramsey, I promised that we'd come back to you, for you had something else to say. Yes. And I am dwelling on this because I think it is a burning issue in the election campaign at the moment. So I am purposely taking some time to
I'm interested that our friend at the back is from the Lib Dems, because if I'm right, Lib Dem councillors did not call in an application that's recently gone in for 3 more stories on Dominion House. Now, Dominion House is at the end of the bus exit, and is therefore right next to where this tall building that everyone is aghast about would have been. Now, that will make it, I think, 12 or 13 stories, won't it? What will it make it?
10 or 11 stories.
Well, it'll still be a tall building, and the ward councillors did not call that into the planning committee, so they obviously were happy with that building being 10, 11, 12 stories.
Okay, so let's go to George and ask for his response on that.
Yeah. Thank you. There were no objections to that scheme, is I think the first point, and I'll also point out that Ramsey, you voted for 8-storey buildings in a conservation area against the advice of the Office of England. So I think rather than getting into tit for tat litigating every single planning application, rather than having a debate about every single planning application in the last 4 years, it might be useful to talk about the broad principles here.
Okay, but no, hold on to it for a minute. You're not going to get it off that quite that easy. But why is it that the party voted the way it did?
On which one?
On the what was the one you mentioned?
Well, they didn't vote. They did not.
Oh yes, right. Because am I not right in thinking that the councillors can have it called in to be viewed by the committee?
Yep. All ward councillors can call in an application to be considered by the planning committee. Very rarely does it happen, because what normally happens is that if something is the threshold is 10 objections. So any 10, if there's 10 or more objections, something comes automatically to the planning committee.
Okay, but given what had happened over North Street, don't you think any councillor would look at the application and say, this is controversial, we ought to debate this properly?
Yep. Again, the question I've got to ask is, well, if it's controversial, then why is nobody objecting, is I think is the point.
Well, but maybe they didn't know.
If you've got...
Okay, okay.
Right, I'd like to thank the Alford UV councillor from the floor for commenting, but, if you want to come up and take Joss's place, that'd be great. But
Okay, so George, you're saying that no one objected, so therefore that's why they didn't.
Well, again, fundamentally, I'm not going to speak for ward council about an application in their own ward. But just like they wouldn't, nobody presume to speak to me about an application.
But have you asked them? Have you asked them why they didn't?
No, because again, here's my point: is not a single person, not a single councillor, despite what they're saying now, not a single councillor raised an eyebrow at the application when it came in.
Okay.
If there had been, I think I would have remembered it.
All right.
And so again, the question I have to ask is,
Okay, can you pass the microphone now to Joss? And I'm going to go on to something else, Joss. Joss, in the last election, you said in one of your leaflets, the character, attractiveness and prosperity of our borough is at stake. It's still at stake, isn't it? And you haven't introduced in the time you've had in the council a height policy that could help protect that. So can you explain why you didn't manage to do that?
So as part of the consultation response to the issues and options of the development management policies, R4GV commissioned a professional planning consultant to guide our response. I think we ended up costing us nearly 10 grand of our own money. That response, when I think I was the only member of the executive at that time, it was when it was the Lib Dem administration. That document, which I think is publicly available on the consultation responses, specifically said there is no height policies, prescriptive height policies. And the other thing that it was concerned about was a lack of prescription around what constituted infilling in the villages, which was a huge issue on the doorstep.
That's not true.
Well, please sit down. Okay, thank you very much.
Shall I finish? Or,
yeah, okay, yeah, do finish.
So we then took that to the discussions at the local plan panel, and the discussions there, to be fair, we lost the argument. And it was agreed by the local plan panel to go forward with a more flexible approach that gave decision makers, be it the planning committee or planning officers, discretion to look at each individual cases and the harms and benefits of those. So it was a much more loose approach where you could look at the individual character of every application and be much more...
Okay, thanks, Joss. Can you pass it back to George? You said that's not true. What's not true?
Well, I'll just point out that if you go to R4GV's website, if you go to tinyurl.com /R4GV-DMP, you can see their submission to the Development Management Policies consultation and page 14. And they quite clearly say that what they support is a views appraisal policy for all developments above a certain height, which is exactly what the planning policy which was implemented by Joss Bigmore as portfolio holder for planning policy since 2021.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go back to Paul, because I've got a question for you, Paul. Now, the Conservatives have been dominant in Surrey and Guildford politics for many decades.
Not recently, but yes.
Over the decades.
Yeah.
But, there are several tall buildings in Guildford that many people really dislike that were built under not your personal, but under Conservative councils. Isn't this a problem that actually goes back years, and shouldn't something have been done about it a long time ago?
I mean, I can think of House of Fraser, which certainly people have very different views.
Your colleague mentioned that when she was driving. Marsha Mosley said that she regrets it when she drives down from the Hog's Back.
I'm pleased to hear she regrets it. It was before my time, but
okay.
There are exceptions. Personally, from my perspective, the biggest regret is Solent, because I was involved in that, and I was involved with a lot of...
So what went wrong there? Why is it the council couldn't control it?
Because we didn't have a height policy that would stand up.
Right. So if you learnt that lesson, why wasn't your first priority to get a height policy?
Right, there were a couple of things here. Number one is it was, but number two is we had to get the local plan part 1 through before we moved on to the development management policies. And by the time the DM policies were being debated, the Conservatives had lost the council. So it was down to the Residents for Guildford and the Lib Dems who were pushing that.
There was some time between the Solent result and the election, wasn't there?
Yeah, but the local plan, part 1, was approved in April 2019, which gave us about 2 weeks to try and do something. So it was impossible.
So doesn't it point to the fact that the local plan shouldn't have been rushed in that way?
No, because one of the issues with the local plan is that once it's gone through the inspector, the planning inspectorate, and the planning inspector has said that it's sound, you are legally obliged to adopt as soon as possible. And we've seen exactly the same with Part 2 under the Lib Dems of Residents for Guildford. So I don't criticise the fact that that's just gone through, because it was the same process. And once it had got to its to being approved for adoption, it is required to have a special meeting and to adopt it. So the timing's been, fun enough, I mean, by coincidence, has been quite similar.
Okay, thank you. And if you could give it back to Ramsey. Ramsey, I'm going to... there's coronation is coming up, and I'm just going to have an early coronation now. You are now the King of Guildford, and I want you to say how you would, what kind of building height policy you would instigate overnight, and why. Yes, and why?
Overnight, there's a limit to what we can do.
Because?
Because the DMP policies have just been
but you're
passed.
the King of Guildford now, so you can...
Well, yes. If I had a magic wand and I could do as I like,
yeah.
Then I would think that the original campaign against the Solum talked about heights of 6 and 7 stories. And I think that is reasonable for Guildford. Sometimes we will have higher. And as we've discussed, it can all depend on the setting and the zonal arrangements. But I would like to think that 6 or 7 stories is quite high enough in this
town. And if
town.
you could hand it back to Claire. Claire, are there environmental aspects to planning that we should consider?
Yes.
Well, I did ask for concise answers. What are the main ones you think?
Okay, so I think there is species diversity, making sure that we maintain the diversity that we have as far as possible within the borough, and where it looks as though we're going to impinge upon that we actually make active efforts to replace anything. So that could be relocation or a simple extension into another part of the borough that would accommodate it. I think some of the comments that were made about when you have tall buildings, how you can affect the quality of the light, that affects the humans that are living inside the buildings as well as any sort of flora and fauna outside. Environmentally, I think there should be more green spaces. I did have a look at the North Street plan, and whilst I accept that there are 4 squares in there, I think there could be a lot more greening of the area. Plus water collection and water harvesting, which can be used to help to maintain temperatures in buildings. And I think I'm going to stop there, if that's okay with you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to move on, but this question is linked somewhat. If you could go to John Pigeon, please, and if you could read out your question number 2.
Yeah. Hello. The question is social media campaigning good for democracy?
Right. And for this one, I'm going to come first of all to you, Anne.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Is social media campaigning good for democracy?
I think any form of campaigning is good for democracy. I do think social media has its place, but I think actually face-to-face is more important. We've been knocking on doors in the Labour Party since January 2022 because we thought it was important to actually speak to people and find out what was important to them, what they were concerned about. Interestingly, and I'm sure you'll all be amazed by this, the local plan didn't come up once. I think there are people that are interested in the local plan, and most of them are probably here tonight. But people that live in normal homes in and around Guildford are much more interested about other things. And whilst I think that social media has a place, there are an awful lot of people who don't access social media. So if you really want to find out what they think and what you're going to do, and if you look at our manifesto, you will see that's a result of what people have said to us is important. It's not our opinions, it's their opinions, and that's what we should all be doing.
Okay, thank you. If you'd like to pass it to George. George, so just to repeat the question, is social media campaigning good for democracy? You've got quite a presence on social media, or you use it quite a bit. What's your view?
Well, I am under 40, in fairness.
So, I beg your pardon?
I am under 40, in fairness, which does help a little bit. But yes, I think I have to agree with Anne. You know, social media is important. It is good for democracy, in the same place for any discussion, any debate is good for democracy. But it definitely has its upsides and downsides. It can very easily become an echo chamber or multiple echo chambers. It's very easy for people to hear just one particular point of view, and you know, certainly it's quite easy for as with face-to-face conversation or for printed press. A lie quite often gets halfway around the world, whilst the truth is still putting its trousers on. And I mean, it's not anything different from what we're used to. It's just a different medium. Certainly, as Liberal Democrats know, we are always out all year round knocking on doors, delivering leaflets to update people face-to-face in person, because it is actually in those face-to-face conversations where you learn the most about them. And I think I'd also agree with Anne that, yes, I don't often hear the local plan mentioned on the doorstep. What I do hear a lot is about how people my age, under the age of 40, can't afford to live in Guildford, how you struggle to pay your rent, how you can't afford to buy homes. I hear people concerned about the fact that we've got air pollution, that their kids are breathing dangerous air, that it's not safe for their children to walk or cycle to school. I hear concern about the state of our town centre, that it's becoming run down and neglected. You know, our platform for this election is we want a greener, fairer, thriving future for our borough.
Right. So
that's
do you
based on what we've spoken
no
to people.
downsides to social media? And do you think campaigning with social media is better, worse, or just the same without it?
I think it's much the same. I think the one downside of social media is that obviously if you put a leaflet out through the door, you've got to have a certain size of organisation to be able to do that. You've got to have there's tight rules regulating it. Social media is still sometimes a bit of a wild west, and it's both a virtue and a downside. That on one hand, it gives everybody their voice and the ability to say something and be heard. It also means that anybody can also pop up and run a very slick campaign out of nowhere as well. You know, it's really the democratisation of media. The easier it is for people to access, and again, not everybody can access it, not everybody does use it, but overall, on balance, I think more voices being heard is better than fewer voices being heard, and I'd much rather get it in the neck from half a dozen people on social media than, you know, do what I often do and do a ward surgery where I'm lucky if I get one or two people turn up. You know, it's balance. You know, you've got to take the rough with the smooth.
Yeah. No, both you and Anne have said that you don't find a lot of concern about the local plan on the doorstep. Yet this video that's going around Battle for Guildford is said to have been, I haven't seen this, I haven't got firm evidence for this, but I've been told it's been viewed thousands of times, in fact tens of thousands of times. Why is that if people don't care about the local plan?
I think people care about the North Street and they care about how decisions are being made in their name by the council. I think that's a universal concern. I think that I certainly have heard. But you're talking about the local plan in general, that's a slightly different.
So it could be the way you're framing the question, couldn't it? Because if you say to someone, what do you think about the local plan, they may not have a particular view on that because they're not engaged. But if you say, do you want tall buildings in Guildford, they're more likely to understand the issue, or at least that part of the issue of the local plan.
I completely agree, but I'd also say, you know, I don't go out to people's doorstep and say, what do you think about the local plan? What do you think about housing? I don't interrogate people on the doorstep. I talk to them and I wait and let them tell me what's bothering them. Okay. And unprompted, I've heard a lot about North Street recently because of the video. Right. Most of the time, most people are talking to me about housing, about healthcare, about schools, about transport, about air pollution, about climate change, not about planning policy, because I don't think it's very interesting for most people until something goes wrong, like happened with North Street.
Okay. Could you pass on to this? Thank you. Right. So back to the original question then, Josh. Is social media campaigning good for democracy?
As George and Anne have said, I think there's two sides to it. I think it is undoubtedly a force for good in the way that you can reach a lot of people very easily and very cheaply. And I think that's undoubtedly good for democracy. I think the danger lies when it is unregulated. So you'll know, Martin, as a regulated news service, you have a duty and it's regulated that you show balance in articles. You know, as a proper news service. Social media is unregulated, so opinion, misrepresentation can be...
Newspapers aren't bound to show balance. That's the broadcasting medium.
Sorry.
But we, on the Guildford Dragon, we do try to show balance.
So anyway, so I apologise for not knowing that. The more unregulated nature of social media, and I think coupled with the general mistrust of anyone in a political position because of the state of politics globally, you know, does lend credence to more outlandish opinions on social media being fact rather than opinion. I think that's dangerous.
And have you seen examples of that?
Well, I mean, obviously, you know, the Badder for Guildford video shows one opinion about the North Street development, and then it's up to us to try and get our message out to show the balanced opinion. That's the task we have. Unfortunately, as a political party, within the pre-election period, we have spending rules. We're not allowed to boost posts on Facebook, so it is much harder for us to compete on a level playing field as a regulated political party in the pre-election period to a private individual that can use the medium to get a message across. So we have to just work harder, to be quite frank, and try and use the old style, knocking on doors and saying, look, you know, that is one opinion. You know, this is the unbiased planning report, and this is our opinion. Please think about both sides. If you still choose to disagree with us, that's fine. But that takes a lot of time.
Most of us treasure our right to free speech. Is there any other regulation you think needs to be introduced with social media in political campaigning?
I don't think you can restrict private individuals from expressing an opinion in social media. I just think that everyone needs to be very clear that that is somebody's personal opinion and it's not necessarily factual. It may well be factual, but it's not necessarily factual.
Okay, thank you. Right, so to you, Ramsey. Now, again, remind you of the original question about social media. Is it good?
When we produce literature, whether it's billboards or the flyers that we put through people's doors, we put on there who printed it and on behalf of whom and our registered address of the party that it relates to. The videos and the social media, we don't really know who's behind them. We see pitfalls in America especially. We see Russia and China and Korea interfering electronically with elections there and possibly here. There's manipulation. So once you start using social media, you open up a can of worms. Is it good for democracy? I'm not sure. We can use Facebook, we can put things on, we can take photos of ourselves going around, meeting people on the doorstep and advertise what we're doing. Great. But some people take it a step further and then things get spread around and it's very, very difficult once that has happened to counter it because we, as has been said earlier, we have very strict spending allowances during the election period.
Okay, if you could pass it to Claire, please. Claire, so as you recall, is social media good or bad for political campaigning or in political campaigning?
Okay, social media campaigning good for democracy.
Yes, sorry, I beg your pardon.
Okay, I think the answer at the moment is edging towards no. I think when stuff goes up on social media, we all have to be aware that there's a little algorithm working behind it, which is deciding what each of us gets to see. So what I see is not going to be the same as what somebody in the back row here sees. So therefore, we're not all getting the same or a similar message from the different campaigning groups or individuals. Also, once you go online, it is not an inclusive medium. Not everybody has access to a device, whether that's a laptop, a desktop or a phone or whatever you're going to use. So again, we're not all getting access to the same sort of information and able to make the same informed decisions. Sorry, I phrased that incorrectly. Able to make informed decisions from the same sort of information base. I would also say, echoing what has been said already, that when you have a voice on social media, it needs to be a trusted voice. Any doubts, and it's just undermining the campaign. Thank you.
1 minute. I just want to ask a supplementary. So what would you do? You've described some of the problems, but what would you do to make the situation better?
That is a very difficult question. There is the online harms bill, which I believe is still going through Parliament. My current feeling on that bill, I know this is dealing with a matter at national level rather than local level, is that it may prove to be too strict. I think we need to know what these algorithms are, and that social media companies should be making these public so that they can be fully assessed by independent experts. Okay, thank you. Pass it on to Paul. Now, Paul, you've insulted a few people on social media.
Surely never.
So what's your view on whether it's good for democracy or not?
I think it is, on balance, it's good for democracy, but I certainly understand the concerns. There are many different types of social media. You know, locally, Nextdoor is used extensively, particularly by Maddie, and some of the other councillors. And Nextdoor is a pretty open frame. You know, Twitter is very easy for people to follow and to respond to. Facebook, of course, from a councillor and politician's perspective, is now much more controlled than it was before. So that's moved in the right direction. Instagram, perhaps less so, but given the fact it's Meta, then one assumes it will also catch up. It's useful for getting information out there. It's also useful for correcting information. So is social media good overall? It would be good if people stuck to facts and opinions that were based on facts. Where it goes wrong...
But that's the rub, isn't it? I mean, that's the problem.
Where it goes wrong is misinformation. And it doesn't really matter which party, any party suffers from misinformation. And that's quite frustrating. But I'm sure if you asked any party if banning campaigning by social media was a good idea, no party would agree. Okay. So, you know, you just have to live with what you have.
But of course, it's subject to the normal rules of defamation, isn't it?
Sure it is, absolutely.
Do you think people are aware enough of that? And are there authorities following up those cases where people are defamed?
I think more so now, actually, Martin, yes. If we go back 10 years, I think probably not. But if you look at the situation over the last 3, 4, 5 years, things have improved. I mean, there are plenty of cases now in terms of defamation, some proven. So, you know, the courts are taking issues seriously.
But are there rules, aren't there, about spending political parties spending on their campaigns?
Absolutely.
Doesn't the presence of social media allow people to bypass those rules?
No.
You don't think it does?
I don't think it does, because we talked, or Claire talked quite correctly about the algorithms, etc. And the only way you can really bypass algorithms is through paid. But you have to declare those. So if you're actually running a campaign truthfully, then that's a cost, and that has to be declared. Okay. Is anyone with strong feelings in the audience that would like to say something? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Oh, it's on already. Thank you. I think this is so important for the future of our planet, never mind just Guildford, to be educated against misinformation, to help us as ordinary citizens make a decision by information given to us in the press, which is more easy to see, but we know that there are biases in the press, and in social media, yes, you can investigate and tell who is has got any backup or any evidence behind their claims. But I don't feel educated enough to investigate information that I find, whether that be in the press or on the doorstep. My friends talk a whole pile of unsubstantiated information. So how do I check? I need more backup to check the information.
Okay, as a matter of interest, would you believe something in the press more than social media or not?
Well, I read most of my newspapers on social media, so no. But I would put most comments on social media that are below the article as just somebody's opinion, like my neighbour or, you know, somebody you might speak to on the doorstep. You know, so when you're concerned about their concerns, are they well informed? And that would help everybody to make better decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so now we're going to move, time's against us, so we need to move on to another subject. And I'd like Graham Brown to ask his question, please.
Thank you. What policies will the candidates propose to improve the situation regarding traffic in the town centre? How will they balance congestion, parking, low-carbon transport, improving air quality, and, considering the lady in the audience, the economic prosperity of the town?
Thank you. Now, of course, roads are a county council responsibility, but the borough council does have an interest and input into those policies. So, Claire, can I come to you first on that, please?
Okay. This is a big question. So I think my immediate answer is with difficulty, because you've asked for a lot of different factors to be balanced out there. In terms of congestion, I think we need to relook at the park and rides, because if I've remembered correctly, 2 of them have closed down and have not been reopened. So I think there's something there to try and help congestion. In terms, I'm going to take your point about economic prosperity and have a stab at that. And this is why it's a balancing act, because you don't want to reduce visitors coming into Guildford and reduce our prosperity, but you also don't want a lot of vehicles coming in and increasing the pollution in the streets in the centre of town. This probably ultimately leads us back to the North Street development in some ways, but I'm going to limit my comments there and let other members of the panel have a go at your question.
Okay, if you'd like to pass it to Paul, please.
I was hoping you'd come to me last. This is a very tricky one. We spent, years in the previous administration and indeed before my administration looking at all the various issues around transport and around the climate change, etc. I mean, there is a positive, and that is, whether you agree with electric vehicles or not, the simple fact is that they do not emit as they move around at the same level as other modes of transport. So things will improve anyway, and my colleague Ramsey will be relieved because he has a serious issue near him, which is caused by transport, and anyone that lives anywhere near the A3 certainly suffers, and anyone that lives near the A331, from my perspective, certainly suffers. You can look at it, you can model it, you can work with your county council. Certainly in my time we were working with national government as well, and it's nigh on impossible to reach agreement. Always challenges. If you try to make changes with great respect to residents of any place, change is usually raising concern. So you have your own challenges there where people are not impressed with suggestions. Even the humble bicycle and putting in bicycle routes seems to upset as many people as it satisfies others. So you do have to be unpopular to drive that forward. It's been easier for the Conservatives to watch the residents for Guildford and Lib Dems challenge and tackle this over the last 4 years. I don't believe they've made much progress, but I understand that because we found it very difficult. You can spend incredible amounts of money on trying to come up with solutions, and it's almost impossible.
Okay, now I can remember interviewing you when you were council leader and the local plan was progressing, and you made a pretty firm commitment that the housing development was not going to happen without the infrastructure.
Correct.
But that's not what we're seeing, is it? And when you look at roads in particular, I mean, the A281, if we take that as an example, I can't see how you could widen the A281 along its length because of the buildings around it. So how is it possible to square this circle?
Well,
and just before you start,
at what cost is the question?
Has it been? Do you think it's been strongly represented upwards that we have a real problem here, and it's for the government to keep pressurising us to build more and more homes is not as easy as they might like to make it?
I don't think it makes any difference who the national government is. They're promoting housing. It's just a fact. In relation to local government, local Tories have a very strong view, and that is that you should not be overdeveloping without having the infrastructure. And I don't mean that infrastructure follows 10 years later. The local plan was designed to deliver the SHMA number, but in doing so, the protection...
Can you explain what the SHMA is? Not everyone might know.
Strategic Housing Market Assessment, which is, many different views, but let's be honest, it's a fudged algorithm set by central government. And whilst many people complain and they try and work the numbers through, simple fact is it's not that complicated. Right or wrong, you follow a path, and at one end it spits out the number of housing units that you're expected. It's slightly more complicated because you have employment land and you have other things. But at the end of the day, everyone who's doing a local plan is working on to the same base algorithms, flawed or not. And you end up with a position where you have a number of units that you are supposed to build out within your local plan area.
Okay. If you could just pass the microphone to Ramsey. But before, Ramsey, you speak, I'd just like to ask the audience, is there anyone here that has strong views on infrastructure and development and whether you think it's right at the moment? There's several hands at the back there.
Yes, I want to know, I live in West Guildford, in Onslow Village. I want to know why you don't take into account the infrastructure. I've heard a lot about planning. I've heard nothing about the fact that the medical facilities at North Street aren't being taken up by the Strategic Health Board in our area. I can't work out if the council at either borough or county level are speaking to the health service about that to sort it. I think our roads are going to clog up with extra traffic for all these developments that you want to put in for social housing. That's great. I would like people to be able to afford to live in Guildford, but I don't think we're going to be able to get from one side of Guildford to the other.
So you don't feel...
I see no infrastructure planning at all, and I want to hear about that. Why aren't you building more doctors' surgeries? Why aren't you getting more schools? Why aren't the roads being sorted? You can't even get the potholes out. And I hear about cycle routes. I've been campaigning for cycle racks outside our local shops for ages, and you can't even afford a few cycle racks.
Well done, madam. You've made your point very clearly. Ramsey, it's a good point, isn't it?
I think she makes some very good points. They're all very good points, and it comes down to this, the only things that we can do as GBC. Many of the issues fall into Surrey County Council or highways or the government. We have argued for more park and rides, but the general consensus from officers is that park and rides have been declining before COVID, and since COVID they've declined even further, and in addition there's a shortage of bus drivers and the situation is very difficult. But we would love to have a park and ride, for instance, at Shalford. I'd love a park and ride at Merrow. I'd love one on the south of the A3. And we then ensure that people park, take an electric bus into town and that would help solve things. One of the big problems with the local plan is it's put 3 or 4 big sites in unsustainable greenbelt locations. And these are very much car dependent, and they will add to the problems. And when we were talking about these issues, one particular executive advisory board meeting, one of the officers stood up and said, on a particular site, we haven't got the infrastructure, we'll find other ways around it. That, to me, is totally wrong. We have always said there should be infrastructure first. When it comes to planning meetings, we have a problem, because if we point out that the roads aren't suitable or this isn't suitable, we will be told, but Surrey County Council highways have not objected, therefore you can't raise that. And we are stymied in that respect, and it is a big problem. It has to be more joined up. I was pleased to work with the parish councils to get the first 2 AQMAs delivered in Compton and Shalford. The air quality is very important. And when we looked at demolishing Debenhams, the Surrey County Council put forward a transport management plan for the lorries to go through the AQMAs, both the first 2 and then subsequently leave, going through the 3rd one at the gyratory.
Okay, AQMAs are?
Air quality management.
Right, thank you.
So this is madness, because when you have an AQMA declared, you should not be increasing traffic from any development through that AQMA. I therefore questioned, why don't we use the River Way? The River Way was built for this purpose of moving things by barge. And I've spoken with the Way Navigation. They think it would be a wonderful idea. I've spoken with officers to try to press through that. I've spoken to the developer to say, you must consider this.
Okay, do you think there's enough depth of water for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
They did something similar, bringing things in and taking things out when they repaired the weir, a temporary repair to the weir recently. Okay. These are all very serious issues which can be addressed by having a more sustainable local plan that puts more homes in areas that are not car dependent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anne. I'm going to come to you now, because whilst a lot of these issues are not in full control of the Borough Council, a lot of them are linked to the local plan, aren't they? Because the level of development also is linked with the level of congestion and other infrastructure problems. It's not just roads, of course, it's health services, as we've heard, and other things too. But your party, in the interview with Howard, who's here tonight, Howard Smith, you support the local plan, your party. So how are you going to square this circle that we want this development, but we haven't got sufficient infrastructure to support it?
Let me just clarify one issue about the local plan. I think it's important that every council has a local plan. We don't effectively support everything that's in the current local plan. It's due for review, and there are issues in it that we would like to see reviewed. But I think what's important is joined up thinking. It seems to me that we should be looking at infrastructure, roads and planning.
Sorry, Anne, I'm going to interrupt. We all know that joined up thinking is important. How do we do it? If Labour is in charge, what would they do differently that would get that joined up thinking?
If Labour was in charge, I would be up there and I would show them how to do joined up thinking. I think quite a lot of problems in these issues is that people aren't working collegiately, it seems to me. There's a lot of headbanging that's going on between various parties. I think what we need to consider is what's right for the people of Guildford, what's right for developments, and that infrastructure should be considered before the housing planning starts. And if it's not, then you're going to end up with issues like this. I mean, it's not just future development. Actually, what the lady said in the room is what I'm hearing on the doorstep. People are concerned about getting to their doctors. There is discussions going on at the moment, and I know because I'm involved with the local patient group, that surgeries are merging, surgeries are moving. People are worried about how they're going to get to those appointments. People go to bus stops to catch a bus. They turn round, look in their shopping bag, look up, and the bus has been cancelled. It's expensive. If we want young people and families to come into Guildford, if we want to attract tourists, we've got to look at the price of these things. Young families will find it cheaper to drive into Guildford and pay the car parking fees. You know, this is a reality.
So what would you do? What would you do to counter that problem?
Well, I would make all bus travel for under 16s free. Absolutely. I think it's an important cost. I would certainly cap bus fares.
That would take money, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would take money, but that's where my priority would be. It would be actually getting people into Guildford, to bring the life back into Guildford, to do things in Guildford to make families want to come here. There's nothing in there for young children anymore. And that's what people are saying on the doorstep. If we want people to come in and we want congestion to improve, we've got to provide services at affordable prices to encourage people to do that.
Okay, thank you. George, Anne has just said that if she was able to bring it about, Labour would stop development until there is sufficient infrastructure. Is that what the Liberal Democrats would do?
Well, short version is, I think we would like to. You do not have the powers to do so as part of the problem.
Right.
And as I go, I'll go back to the original question by Mr. Brown. But to respond to something that Anne said, I mean, because free bus travel for under 16s, capping bus fares, absolutely, I'm all in favour of it. Guess what? We don't have the powers of Borough Council. The County Council is the Transport Authority, and even they don't have the power. One of the problems that underpins this entire conversation is that far too much power in this country is centralised, far too little power is in the hands of local decision makers, and that hinders joined-up thinking. Now, for my sins, I am at the Borough Council the portfolio holder for climate change, sustainable transport and air quality. So I'm probably got a bit of an advantage in answering this one. But the answer is that joined-up thinking is key but it really has to come from the politicians. Because, for instance, we've got an air quality management zone in the town centre. Now, that is going to probably have to involve something to do with trying to reduce the number of vehicle journeys into the town, trying to have a clean air zone, not a congestion charge, but a clean air zone where you say to the most polluting HGVs or the most polluting buses aren't allowed in. But then that has knock-on effects, because also we're developing a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan, and that's got to tie in with this. We're launching an e-bike hire scheme for the whole of Guildford, including Onslow Village, by the end of this year. That's all got to tie in. I mean, part of the problem you find with a lot of these things is that there are little bits and pieces going on all over the place, and you need to have a joined-up vision for how you're going to tie them all together. That is a huge part of my job, and it's not easy. And I have to say, I don't think that there's anybody who's, I don't think something where there's a massive area of disagreement. We all want what's best. The trick is trying to find out how to join it all together. In terms of the point about infrastructure with development in general and doctor surgeries in schools, I completely agree with the lady who spoke. I mean, I represent Burton Ward. We lost our doctor's surgery in 2020. And part of the reason we lost it was that the clinical commissioning group, which sits completely outside of local government control, they don't want small surgeries, they want big super surgeries where they can centralise services. But, you try getting to them, well, the bus won't work. You can't, lots of people can't cycle or walk there, you can't get a bus to go to it, But the buses are a private enterprise, they're not even controlled by the county council, A lot of these things are difficult. In fairness, the local plan does say on the strategic sites that there has to be a certain degree of infrastructure, there has to be school provision, there has to be transport provision, there has to be health provision, but it's a lot in the eye of the beholder. The most important thing is that when you have new development, that you try to design out car dependency as much as possible. We talked about North Street earlier. For one thing, which I don't think anybody can criticise it for, is that it included hundreds of bicycle storage spaces for people who would have been living there. That's a result of the climate change and sustainability policies that were put through by this council of requiring higher standards of sustainability. But it's not a panacea. Nobody has a magic wand. Okay. But in short, again, you need to have that joined-up approach.
Thank you. If you could pass the microphone to Joss, please. Joss, most of the panel members, if not all of them, have mentioned how difficult it is because the Borough Council doesn't have sufficient powers to ensure that there's sufficient infrastructure for the developments. and they're right, aren't they? And when you were council leader, did you bang on the door of any minister you could to say, look, we've got a real problem here in Guildford? It's probably not, I don't suppose it's unique, but we do have a problem here if we want all this development without the required infrastructure.
I think the issue with banging on ministers' doors is it's a different minister the next day and then the next day, which makes it quite difficult. But I think so it's, yes, everyone, I agree with everything that's said. This is incredibly difficult. I think there's a massive frustration at borough council level, and it should be at resident level too, that as part of the trade-off of development, there are Section 106 payments associated with every development for health, for education. We are currently holding somewhere around, I think it's £20 million worth of unspent Section 106 for health and education that has not yet been allocated to schemes by either the health authorities or the county council. That is a huge frustration because that is meant to be offsetting the harms of development and for infrastructure associated with these developments. And that's a huge frustration. On a more positive note, we have managed in the past, and hats off to Paul and Matt and their team. Park and Ride was a three-way partnership between the county council, the borough council and Stagecoach, and it worked really well. We managed on-street parking. The surplus went to subsidise Stagecoach to provide Park and Ride services. That has now fallen apart post-COVID. Stagecoach have struggled to make money. They've struggled to get bus drivers. Now there's a supply issue for parts for buses. The county council have taken back control of on-street parking, so we don't have any skin in the game. And now we're left with dormant park and ride sites at Spectrum and Onslow. You know, that's a shame.
But we do have skin in the game, don't we?
We do, because we want it to work, but we don't, in that the borough council has no funding or power to get involved in it. But that was a good scheme. I would also say that the way that you know, I've really tried hard to work more with the county council than ministers, to be honest, Martin, because they have a much more direct influence. And the partnership working we did to get the Blackwater Valley Hotspots project.
Sorry, I don't think I heard you. Did you say you have engaged with ministers?
No, I'm saying my primary focus was engaging with Tim at the county council.
Right.
Because, you know, there's highways and education a county. You know, the way we've got the Blackwater Valley Hotspots project over the line, with the county coming up with an extra £2 million to help us fund it. They've just agreed to fund Ash Road Bridge to £5 million, which pretty much saved the project. They didn't need to do that, but that is kind of authorities working together to provide infrastructure to support the housing. So there is some positives, but it does require a lot of relationship building and a lot of people working together to try and get the infrastructure delivered. Right. So it is difficult, but it's not impossible.
But well, I certainly try and encourage through the Dragon for people to know what they're voting for in the different elections, because, you know, obviously the borough council responsibilities are one thing, county council another, national government another, and then you've got other agencies outside them. But, you know, how George had a point, didn't he? With the centralisation we have at the moment, it's very difficult for a council to do what the people expect them to do.
It's amazing. It's an amazing political sleight of hand where the government, central government, keeps all the powers and all the money, and then borough council gets all the blame. And it's incredible. We get it for planning, we get it for infrastructure, we get it for everything. And I can see Paul is doing a wry smile because he knows it's true. But it's an incredible frustration that we have one of the most centralised.
Is there anyone on the panel? I'll come to you. Is there anyone on the panel that disagrees with that point? No. Okay. Anne, you wanted to say something.
Well, I just wanted to come back on a couple of things that George had said, actually, that I don't know if you're aware, but the Labour Party has a sister party called the Cooperative Party. And if you go to different areas in the country, you will find cooperatives who basically are community-based projects for the benefit of the community. And we all have to remember that it's the community that funds the council, it's our money. And what they do is they set up cooperative bus schemes. It doesn't matter whether it's county council or borough council or somebody in Westminster. They set these up for the benefit of the community, where the community actually works together to provide the buses, provide drivers, and make the service self-sufficient, and funds more buses by feeding the profits back into buying more buses. Now, it's a different way forward, and I just think that maybe what we need to do is is think about more community projects like that, that it's a really positive thing to do. And actually, it gives people what they're asking for without needing to go through all the different authorities.
Thanks, Anne. Right, I just want to squeeze one more question in. If you could, if we can start with Joss, and I just want you to speak for up to a minute on this next question from Graham, not Graham Brown, I beg your pardon, we've just had his.
It's very slick, this man.
Who is the one with the question about the river? Here we are. It's from... No, not Philip Brookins. Here we are. Sunitha.
You're almost there.
I beg your
Good evening. And is it on?
Yeah.
In a weakening national policy context, what specific action you would commit to take to protect and indeed to improve the quality of the water of the riverway?
Right, I'll read it again just with greater volume. In a weakening national, is that policy? Yeah, context, what specific actions would you commit to protect the quality of the water in the riverway? Joss, really keep it brief, please.
Okay, well, I mean, the major thing we're doing is upgrading the sewage treatment plants at Slyfield. So, you know, in the next 5 years, hopefully that will be a much cleaner plant with much greater capacity and hopefully a lot less overflow into the riverway. Practically, that's the only thing we have on the schedule at the moment. But obviously, you know, the river is one of the biggest assets in the town, and we need to do everything we can. But it's a national trust asset. So again, it requires partnership working, obviously, with the government and the regulations of the water companies to make sure that we're reducing the incredible amounts of waste that we're pumping into the rivers is something we all need to be challenging.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll point out as well, it's not just Riverway, it's also the Tillingbourne and the other rivers in that area which also need this. But what I'd do, easiest thing, is simply reverse the government's decision to allow water companies to dump sewage in our rivers without penalty, because fundamentally, whilst we do have an ageing sewage treatment works, it's right next to my ward of Bertham. We're the ones where they dump the sewage in, so it's lovely if you go for a walk down Riverside and see brown things floating in it. But the amount of dumping was already a problem before the national government changed the policy. Since then, the dumping by Thames Water has massively increased. And whilst, Joss is quite right, we are regenerating the Wayside urban village area along Slyfield. We're building 1,500 houses, 40% affordable, brownfield, council-owned site. And as part of that, the sewage treatment works is moving and being replaced. But in the meantime, Thames Water, rather than facing up to the fact that they've got a shortfall in their current sewage treatment plant and making investments to meet that shortfall while they're building the new one, they're just dumping more and more sewage into the river. They're letting the sewage back up in their pipes. If you come over to Bertham right now, you will see Thames Water vehicles out around the A3 because the sewage pipe underneath the A3 has burst from the amount of pressure of backing up sewage. So the raw national thing I do is stop them being allowed to get away with it.
Thank you, George. Anne.
Well, I don't really know what I can add to that, to be honest with you. I know Thames Water is actually investing in a new sewage works. It's a disgrace. I mean, get rid of the MP that bloody voted to allow sewage to be dumped, I mean, let's be honest. If we've got a parliament that actually approves a bill like this, what hope do we have? I mean, Thames Water being nationalised doesn't help. I could go on. I used to work for the Water Research Company years ago, and I have to say this would not have been allowed. You walk round Guildford, you see the new meter holes flooding, you see sewers overflowing. It's a disgrace. We need to actually have a service that is actually serving us instead of serving the people that are making profits. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Very good timekeeping.
Thank you. This all goes back to when the Conservatives privatised the water industry. The main reason being that to try and do the massive work that needed doing would have severely affected government borrowing. And the idea was we could use private funds. Private capital has failed to upgrade the Victorian sewage systems, pipes and equipment. Overdevelopment of of Guildford has, with all the new sites, has added to the pressure and more burst sewage pipes. I visited Thames Water only a few weeks ago, and I had a tour around their water treatment plant in my ward in Shalford. They do a pretty good job, but the problem is in Godalming at the sewage works there, which discharges a lot of sewage into the River Wey, and also the problem with Slyfield.
Okay, that's your minute. Thank you. If you could pass it on, please. Claire.
Okay, so yes, fully agree with what George and Anne have said. I would add two other things into the mix. One would be that there are now, I think, 2 or 3 rivers that have been converted into legal entities, which is being used as a means of protecting the water quality in those rivers. And that is something that could be looked at for at least the River Wey, if not more rivers within Guildford Borough. The second thing I would say is that it is Green Party policy to take back utilities into public ownership. And that is an alternative as well.
Okay, thank you. And Paul.
Thank you. This is a really tricky one because I don't think anyone here would accept or like the idea of just continuing to send waste into water streams of whatever size. So I think we can all agree that something needs to be done. We can solve it in part, and Joss mentioned the project that's taking place at the old Slyfield site. It's not, unfortunately, Thames Water that's paying, it's Guildford Borough Council who's paying for that. Something that I think is wrong, but that's the way that it works out. And that only fixes one small part. Godalming is another example. We've got so many different tributaries that unless everything is fixed, it's going to come to the same or similar issue. I will defend our MP because I understand why her and many others took the approach they did. And that simply was that you can't just instantly decide, because we would all be up in arms if we found that we had waste coming out because of the fact that we've banned the use. But what should just 10 seconds more, because I actually don't think that anyone will disagree. But Martin, we need to move as quickly as possible to stop it. Simple as that.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, our time is up this evening, I'm afraid. I'm going to ask you all a question now. Is there anyone here that doesn't intend to vote on May the 4th? That's good. Okay, how many of you will regard planning as the main issue on which you're voting? Not that, a fair smattering. Okay, interesting. Well, thank you very much. Now, that concludes the hustings meeting. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you persuade others to engage with local politics and to vote, for whichever party, of course. Finally, I would like to thank once again our host, the United Reformed Church, my Dragon colleagues, Hugh Coakley and Tony Ferris, the panel members, of course, and most of all to you, the audience, for turning out this evening. Thank you.